There is a moment in every political standoff when the posturing ends and the real cost begins to show. Not on the front pages, not in the press conferences, but in the quiet arithmetic of supply chains, pension funds, and the livelihoods of people who never once thought their morning commute to work had anything to do with a tariff negotiation happening 3 time zones away. That moment, for North America, arrived in the spring of 2025, and very few people were watching closely enough to understand what it actually meant. To understand how the United States and Canada arrived at this particular confrontation, you have to go back further than the headlines. You have to understand that the relationship between these two countries has never been as simple as the word allies suggests. It has always been a relationship defined by economic dependency dressed up as partnership, by proximity mistaken for alignment, and by decades of trade arrangements that benefited both sides just enough that neither felt compelled to renegotiate the underlying assumptions. That arrangement, fragile as it always was, began unraveling the moment Donald Trump returned to the White House. Trump's second administration came in with a mandate to rethink everything. That was not merely campaign rhetoric. It was a governing philosophy, one that treated inherited international agreements not as foundations to build upon, but as concessions made by weaker predecessors who had been outmaneuvered. The tariff strategy that defined the first months of his second term was not accidental, and it was not impulsive, whatever it looked like from the outside. It was a deliberate effort to use economic pressure as a substitute for diplomatic negotiation, to force partner nations into postures of concession before any conversation had formally begun. Canada, as America's largest trading partner, and its most geographically intimate neighbor, was always going to be among the first to feel that pressure directly. The railway question did not begin as a railway question. It began as something much broader and much older, the question of how integrated North American infrastructure actually is, and what happens when a political leader decides to use that integration as leverage. The freight rail systems that run between the United States and Canada are not two separate networks with a clean border crossing between them. They are, in practical terms, a single circulatory system. Grain from the American Midwest moves north. Manufactured goods from Ontario move south. Lumber, potash, crude oil, automobiles, the movement is continuous, interdependent, and extraordinarily sensitive to disruption. When the Trump administration began applying tariffs to Canadian goods in early 2025, the immediate and visible consequence was a spike in transportation costs that the existing rail infrastructure was not structured to absorb. The figure of $573 billion did not emerge from thin air. It represented, according to the economic framework being circulated within the administration's trade advisory circles, the cumulative projected cost of modernizing and reorienting American rail capacity to reduce dependency on cross-border freight movement. The argument being made, quietly at first and then loudly, was that the United States had for decades subsidized Canadian economic efficiency by providing the infrastructure through which Canadian exports moved to global markets. The tariffs in this framing were not protectionism. They were, in the language of the administration's allies, a correction. A long overdue accounting for value that had flowed in one direction for too long. Canada did not accept that framing. It rejected it, in fact, with a clarity and a firmness that surprised many observers who had expected Ottawa to negotiate quietly and make the kind of incremental concessions that had resolved previous trade disputes. What happened instead was something different, and to understand why, you have to understand the political position that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney found himself in. Carney had entered politics from a world defined by the cold precision of institutional finance. As a former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, he had spent his career managing crises, communicating carefully, and making decisions under conditions of enormous complexity and consequence. He was not a politician in the traditional sense. He was, in many ways, the opposite of Trump, deliberate where Trump was impulsive, understated where Trump was declarative, trained to think in systemic terms where Trump thought in transactional ones. When Trump's administration began publicly framing the tariff dispute in terms that suggested Canada was a dependent state in need of realignment, Carney's response was not to negotiate the premise. It was to reject it entirely. The statement that came out of Ottawa in response to the $573 billion demand was measured in tone, but brutal in substance. Canada's position, as communicated through official channels and reinforced in Carney's public remarks, was essentially this: the integrated nature of North American infrastructure is not a Canadian dependency on American generosity. It is a mutual arrangement that generates value for both economies, and any attempt to reprice it unilaterally will not produce the concessions being sought. It will produce a managed decoupling. Canada, the statement made clear, was prepared to accelerate its investments in alternative trade routes, through Pacific ports, through its own internal rail corridor expansions, and through deepened trade relationships with European and Asian partners that had been, until recently, secondary priorities. That response landed differently in Washington than the administration had anticipated. The expectation had been that Canada, facing the prospect of sustained tariff pressure on industries from aluminum to agriculture, would come to the table quickly and accept some version of the renegotiated terms being proposed. What happened instead was a signal from Ottawa that it was willing to absorb short-term economic pain in exchange for long-term structural independence. That is a different kind of negotiating position, and it is one that is very difficult to counter with more tariffs. What makes this story worth sitting with, beyond the headline numbers and the diplomatic posturing, is what it reveals about the nature of economic interdependence as a political tool. Trump's strategic instinct, and it is, in its own way, a coherent instinct, has always been that dependency creates leverage, and that leverage can be converted into concessions. That logic works in real estate transactions. It works in bilateral negotiations with smaller economies that have fewer alternatives. It works, sometimes, in trade disputes between parties with radically unequal power. But it runs into a specific problem when the dependency is genuinely mutual, when the party being pressured has both the resources and the political will to absorb the cost of resistance, and when the act of resistance itself becomes politically valuable domestically. Carney's political position inside Canada was strengthened, not weakened, by the confrontation. The Canadian public, which had been watching American political volatility with increasing unease since Trump's first term, responded to a posture of firm non-capitulation with something close to national solidarity. The $573 billion demand, rather than intimidating the Canadian government into compliance, functioned as a political gift, a moment that allowed Carney to define his administration's character not in abstract terms but in the concrete and visible terms of a standoff with the most powerful political figure in the world. There is something worth reflecting on here about how power actually functions in the modern democratic context. Trump's leverage in this dispute was real. The economic pain that sustained tariffs can impose on a trade-dependent economy like Canada's is not theoretical. Industries that rely on smooth cross-border movement face genuine disruption, and that disruption eventually becomes visible in unemployment figures and corporate earnings reports. The leverage was real. But leverage is not the same as control, and the willingness to absorb pain is not the same as weakness. Carney understood that. And the decision to communicate that understanding publicly, clearly, and without the kind of diplomatic softening that typically characterizes Canada-US exchanges, was itself a political act of considerable consequence. The railway bailout demand as a specific policy proposal faced a second problem that went beyond the diplomatic dynamics. The numbers themselves, when subjected to serious economic analysis, did not survive scrutiny. The $573 billion figure assumed a model of North American freight movement that bore only partial resemblance to how goods actually move. It assumed that American rail infrastructure could be expanded and reoriented on a timeline that was, by any realistic assessment, a decade or more away from feasibility. It assumed that Canadian exports, rerouted away from American corridors, would simply find a less efficient path to market and accept the cost, rather than finding alternative infrastructure investments that would, over time, reduce their exposure to American transit corridors entirely. The economic logic, in other words, punished Canada in the short term while accelerating precisely the structural changes that would reduce American leverage in the long term. That is the quiet irony at the center of this story. The aggressive use of economic pressure, in this case, may ultimately produce the opposite of the intended result. If Canada follows through on its infrastructure diversification strategy, and the early signs suggest it will, the outcome of this confrontation will not be a Canada more dependent on American goodwill. It will be a Canada that has invested seriously in reducing that dependency, that has deepened its relationships with alternative trading partners, and that has done so with the political legitimacy that comes from having been publicly pressured into it by an American administration that miscalculated both the leverage and the response. History is full of moments like this. Moments when the application of power produces not submission but transformation. Moments when a demand intended to demonstrate dominance instead clarifies, for the party being pressured, the importance of building independence. The Marshall Plan worked because it offered reconstruction without demanding political capitulation. Trade pressure works when the pressured party has no viable alternative, and no domestic political constituency for resistance. When both of those conditions are absent, the same tools that look like leverage from one side look like acceleration from the other. What remains unresolved as this confrontation continues to unfold is the question of what the $573 billion demand was actually meant to achieve. If it was meant to generate a headline, to signal to the American domestic audience that the administration was taking a hard line on trade relationships that had historically favored America's partners, it succeeded. If it was meant to produce a negotiated settlement in which Canada agreed to new terms on freight transit and border infrastructure, it failed. If it was meant to begin a longer process of structural renegotiation, that process is now underway, but its direction is no longer fully within Washington's control. This is the nature of political power in the contemporary world. It is enormous and it is genuinely constrained. The constraints are not always military, and they are not always legal. Sometimes the most significant constraint on power is simply the willingness of the people being pressured to look clearly at their situation, to calculate what they are actually willing to accept, and to communicate that calculation without flinching. Canada, in the spring of 2025, did exactly that. Whether that moment becomes a turning point in the broader story of North American political and economic relations, that is a question that will take years, perhaps decades, to answer fully. But the moment itself, quiet and consequential in equal measure, deserves to be understood for exactly what it was.